Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. Despite Prime Minister Modi and the entire Foreign Office putting all our diplomatic weight behind India's desire to enter the nuclear suppliers group, the news that India has been stonewalled by China and a handful of other members of the NSG has come as a big shock to the Indian Ministry of External Affairs and the Indian government.
India's last-ditch diplomatic effort to enter the NSG, a group of 48 nuclear supplier nations, was stonewalled by China in Seoul, which adopted the moral high ground that NSG membership must be only for signatories of the NPT or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that India has refused to sign, as it discriminates between the nuclear weapon powers and those like India who joined the nuclear club after the NPT was created. To appease the handful of NSG naysayers, China played up India's resistance to signing the NPT to block India's entry, adding that India and Pakistan be treated at par, a claim that has few takers, if any, due to Pakistan's record of shady nuclear trade and proliferation. India's desperation to enter the NSG, the exclusive club of countries with nuclear technology, was based on the premise that an India-friendly Obama administration has a few months to go before a new government takes over, and a strong US push in India's favor may not come automatically from the new dispensation in Washington. China, on the other hand, has been peeved by India's growing closeness to Washington and the recent diplomatic initiatives by Delhi with Japan, Vietnam and the US, which present challenges to Beijing in Asia. As the NSG takes decisions only by consensus, by blocking India's entry, China has killed many birds with a single move. The message to India is now unequivocal, that China will not allow India to grow unhindered as it presents a challenge to Beijing's hegemony in Asia, more so in the subcontinent where China is steadily winning over India's neighbors. More importantly, the big question is, after this inability to enter the NSG, despite the existing NSG waiver of 2008, and with almost all the member countries standing in support of India, what are India's options, both for energy generation and to challenge the Chinese?
And to look at what really led India into this last-minute hustle to try and get all the votes necessary from this group of 48 countries to become member of the NSG, and the implications now for India not being a member of the NSG, and how does it impact on India's long-term designs. We have two very well-qualified experts on the subject. We have Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who has held many distinguished ambassadorial posts and was also the special envoy of former Prime Minister till 2014 on disarmament and non-proliferation, clearly one of our diplomatic experts on the subject. And we have once again with us Professor Bharat Karnad of the CPR, and quite clearly amongst India's foremost minds and authors of many works on nuclear issues and strategic issues. Professor Bharat Karnad, sir, my first question to you: what was this big deal about wanting to get into the NSG, particularly when we had the waiver of 2018, which allowed us to import all the necessary stuff, technology, uranium, etc., that we needed for our ambitious nuclear program, which would have, if it worked to a plot, would have raised our nuclear energy capacity from 3% to about 9 or 10%. So why this hurry to get into the NSG now?
Well, I've been trying to understand this puzzle as well, because I think it's not very clear. The reasons for seeking entry are not immediately apparent. But I think Ambassador Sood will perhaps expound on the idea that maybe this was a way station to gaining entry into the Wassenaar Agreement and other technology denial regimes, which are now dealing in cyber warfare technologies. So I think we wanted to get our leg into that camp, just so that we are not excluded, as we have been from other technology areas in the past. So perhaps that's the reason. But as you say, in terms of technology, trade and commerce, we derive no great advantage that we didn't have prior to trying to get into the NSG. meaning, as you say, the 2008 waiver pretty much covers all our needs in terms of, or meets all our requirements in terms of enabling Indian exports and import mainly of nuclear uranium, raw material, and export of indigenously developed technologies. So we didn't really need the NSG for that purpose.
Right. Ambassador Sood, sir, China has cited the NPT clause, and it seems that many of China's diplomatic friends, as it were, at least 4 or 5 of them that we know of, have continued to reiterate that NPT clause, which says that as per the NSG that you should be an NPT signatory to get into the NSG. But I remember you mentioning to me that as per the 1st January 1967 barrier, under the NPT, it has certain restrictions on who can now join the NPT. So everybody else who seems to be going along with the Chinese line, you mean to say they haven't read the documents?
No, I think, well, let me first elaborate this point a little bit for the benefit of our viewers. The NPT says that those who exploded a device before 1 January 1967 are classified as nuclear weapon states, and all other countries are classified as non-nuclear weapon states. So in terms of that definition, which the NPT has, it cannot accept India as a nuclear weapon state unless it amends this rule. And India is not going to give up its nuclear weapons and join as a non-nuclear weapon state. So to me, the Chinese argument of putting forward the NPT is completely a hogwashed argument. And in fact, it is nothing but a desire on their part to lock India into a relationship of hyphenation with Pakistan and to keep India locked into the territory of South Asia.
True, but how is it that the rest of the world, which seems to have many wise men sitting right now in Korea and in earlier engagements in Vienna elsewhere, have not raised this question that, you know, how are you expecting India to sign the NPT when the NPT itself is a document which is passé?
Well, for the rest of the world, for countries like Austria or Ireland or New Zealand or some of these countries, the NPT is almost an article of faith. It's like religion.
Right.
And to them, therefore, they don't understand India's security environment. And to them, therefore, NPT is the be-all and end-all. They are not willing to see the weaknesses of the NPT. And there are many weaknesses of the NPT. The NPT cannot deal with the reality of India and Pakistan, just as the NPT cannot deal with the reality of North Korea or with the reality of Iran. That is why even the Iran nuclear deal had to take place outside the NPT framework.
Great. Professor Karnad, sir, now going back to the China point, and which is something that you understand better than most of us. China is doing what it wants, and as Martin Jacques also puts it in his book, When China Rules the World, that China will continue to insist on containing India within the subcontinent. You are a strong advocate of India becoming a global power, and you have some very clear views on that. How do we now get out of this trap in a way that China has laid for us, as Ambassador Sood brings out, by trying to get the whole world once again to look at this hyphenated relationship that if India gets in, then Pakistan gets in, and Pakistan has always been following our coattails, so it's nothing new for them.
I think one of the ways is to not hanker for the NSG membership all that much.
Right.
And use our entry into the missile technology control regime as leverage, as a counter leverage against Beijing. Why? Because China has applied for membership in the MTCR since 2004 and has been denied the membership on the basis of its extraordinarily flagrant, proliferant record.
But is MTCR also consensus-based?
Yes. No, well, it's also consensus-based, so India then gets a veto over China's entry.
Great.
Hopefully, in the future, that will be used as a counter-pressure, and let's see, assuming that Chinese are amenable to such pressure, we'll then be able to, in a sense, checkmate their entry into the MTCR. Recall what I said. in terms of NSG, we already have a waiver and can continue with our commerce, nuclear commerce and trade. And with entry into the MTCR, any export or import of missile technologies, components, whatever, is entirely sanctioned by the MTCR, meaning neither the customer nor the supplier is anyway, shall we say, punished for, say, selling to whatever country it wants. So what we should do, and we should begin doing, is to very quickly transfer the sort of missiles that Vietnam and the Southeast Asian countries have been asking for.
Like
Indonesia, like especially the BrahMos, supersonic cruise missile. So you have Indonesia, you have Malaysia, you have Vietnam in particular, the lead countries that have asked BrahMos by name. We should quickly transfer it, and MTCR, in a sense, sanctifies and legitimates the transactions. Once you have these countries, in a sense, hounding China in its own backyard with the supersonic cruise missiles on board their ships or in coastal batteries, such as Vietnam can feature, you pretty much neuter and neutralize the most powerful fleet in the Chinese Navy, the South Seas Fleet, out of Hainan and the Sanya base. So that's the sort of thing, hard power game India should begin to play. And also, one should recognize that India has perhaps as advanced a missile as any other country has in its Agni 5. It's an extraordinarily accurate missile, extraordinarily lightweight. Its motors are made of carbon composites. It has very long range, extendable range. It has all the attributes of an extreme deterrent.
Well, thanks so much for these inputs, because here is room for optimism for us. And for those people who are sort of walking around with their heads down in South Block that all is lost, all is certainly not lost. Thanks to you, sir. We'll be back after a break. That India still has a few trump cards up its sleeves, but that after a break. Welcome back. We continue to have our two distinguished guests with us. Ambassador Sood, sir. The argument that was put across by the Modi government that getting into the NSG, the motivation was A, that we have a favorable Obama administration right now. We really don't know how things are going to move after the next American election. B, we were actually needing the shot in the arm to get more nuclear technology and material so that we could contribute to the green initiatives of the world post the global summits. And most importantly, it would help us to fulfill our own immediate energy requirements, even though bulk of our energy continues to be coal-based and energy sources come from the import of oil and hydrocarbon and various other things. So to what extent was this argument purely based to get onto what is the so-called high table of nations, though I don't really believe it's exclusive, if it can have the likes of Malta out there, and soon might see Namibia also there?
Well, first, we produce about 2% of our electricity from nuclear reactors. And that is only going to go up to about 4 or 5%, even if all our ambitious plans of moving to 50,000 megawatts materialize. Today we produce 4,800 megawatts of nuclear power. Secondly, in terms of our access to natural uranium as a fuel, or access to technology for advanced nuclear reactors, we have already signed about a dozen agreements in this regard with various countries. And to that extent, following the waiver which we were granted in 2008. And so therefore, the Modi government, in terms of pursuing NSG membership, was looking at a political objective, not something which would have a practical implication in terms of accessing either nuclear fuel or nuclear technology. To the last point regarding the US role, I think the US played its role as much as it could. But let's not forget that 2016 is not 2008. I mean, 2008, after that was the financial crisis in the West. We saw that. China today is a much more self-assertive country under President Xi Jinping than China was in 2008 under President Hu Jintao. And secondly, India today is also a much more confident country, and Prime Minister Modi has invested a lot in building up a personal relationship with President Xi Jinping, and I think he thought that this would deliver.
Right. Professor Karnad, sir, there is a view that as far as the NSG was concerned, the NSG was something that had been addressed too little too late. Do you see that as something that our diplomatic corps was trying to make up for lost time, also because our diplomatic capabilities are limited and stretched? And most importantly, the world still views us in many cases, as Ambassador Sood has brought out, that the 2008 waiver was one where we just got past the finish line, and this time they wanted to go back to reinforcing their very article of faith that they keep going on and on about. So how different is the world today in the NSG circles of those 48 countries than it was in 2008, and why is their stance different now than why was it in favor of India in 2008?
Well, look, right now I think China, has been pointed out, is far more assertive. It also has the wherewithal of a great power to a much greater extent than it had in 2008. So at the time when 2008 was being finalized, the US arguments were really that it'll be good to have India on our side for contingencies in the future. That contingency has arrived as far as the US is concerned, with the Chinese flexing their military muscle, building up in a very spectacular fashion their navy, their power projection capabilities and so on. And so you now have what was merely kind of a speculative scenario of 2008 being the reality of 2016.
So you're effectively saying that America was quite open to the idea that India getting stonewalled there would then fall more into the American camp. Is that?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying just the reverse, that America now requires India far more. Now, right, in real terms, in real military terms, than it did then, right, in 2008. Right. And therefore, we should use this fact that we are not really the supplicant. We too often act the supplicant where the United States or anybody else is concerned. We ought to really be, assert ourselves, assert our leverages, assert our independent status, and try to configure situations on our terms. Too often we tend to be joiners. You want to join something or the other, some club or the other, and call it a elite club and so on, instead of doing as the Chinese have always done.
And
kept the distance.
Instead of doing what you say in your book, when we should apply the knowledge we've had over the centuries of actually really exhorting ourselves to perform at the level that we could as a society.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, and yeah, which is a remarkable thesis, and I go along with it. Ambassador Sood, sir, what all can India do now diplomatically to get even with the Chinese? Because I think the lines are very clearly drawn. China is still trying to play innocent and say that, oh, we are just talking of technicalities. They talked of technicalities when they blocked Masood Azhar's censor from the UN. Here again, they're talking of technicalities, but as both of you are agreed that China, and I'm with you on that China will do anything to stall India's footprint getting out of the subcontinent. So what are our choices diplomatically?
Well, first of all, we should take a leaf out of the Chinese book, so to say. Namely, when China applied to MTCR, didn't get in, they did not make it such a high-profile issue. They did not make it, because it is not so important. As I explained earlier, if we had not gotten into the NSG, it would not make that much of a difference, but we invested a lot. You know, when you play chess, you don't lead with your king. You normally protect the king, and you have other pieces with which you lead. In this particular case, I think we forgot how to play chess. We call it an Indian game, but we just forgot the strategy of it. So, but to come back to what you said, what we can do with China, I think there are plenty of things. Bharat has already spoken about the fact that there have been a lot of inquiries about the BrahMos missile from certain countries. We should look at that positively. We may also consider our stance with regard to South China Seas. However, one thing I would caution against, it should not lead us blindly to get into the US camp, because I think that we would lose our sense of autonomy. So this should not be seen as something which should automatically say, oh, so China is against us and therefore let's move closer to the US, because
on those very, very important words, I'd like to wrap the show up because we're really constrained for time. But to sum up, due to paucity of time, we've got 3 or 4 points. One is that India continues to enjoy all the benefits it would have got if it became a member of the NSG because of the 2008 clean waiver that it received from the NSG, which allows India to import all the technology and products that it needs for its ongoing nuclear program. Equally important, it is for us to understand that China, having cited the technical clause of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has been doing what it can to stand up for its all-weather ally Pakistan, but the NPT as a document is outdated and it certainly limits India's entry into the NPT even if India wanted to sign it. More importantly, India as a member of the MTCR can now block China's entry into the MTCR because China is not a member there, and the MTCR gives India full permission to export many of its technologies which can be a huge diplomatic and strategic threat to China, like the BrahMos missile, which India is willing to now give to many countries that sees China as a challenge and a threat. And finally, and most importantly, while the NSG initiative was an initiative of the Prime Minister's office to seek a toehold in the nuclear suppliers group, which is not exactly such an exclusive high-powered club as it has been made out to be. But more importantly, this would give India a wake-up call where its true friends are, certainly not in Beijing. And most importantly, India should not use this stonewalling by China to now move directly into the American camp. Thank you very much for being with us on this show. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, goodbye.